Hey everybody, in this video I want to talk a little bit about personality disorders, and I'm only going to talk about a few personality disorders, but in fact there are 10 total personality disorders, and they're usually broken down into three clusters, and those three clusters include uh, the autocentric, that's cluster A. That might include things like paranoid personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder. Cluster B, which is the one that I'm going to talk about, is the dramatic and impulsive cluster, and that's going to include antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, both of which I'm going to discuss. It might also include histrionic or narcissistic. And then cluster C includes the anxious, fearful, and avoidant personalities. Um, it's important to point out that personality disorders are what we sometimes call egosyntonic disorders, which means the individuals who have personality disorders, they don't know that they have a disorder. In most of the disorders that we've talked about, if you're depressed, if you are, have an anxiety disorder, there's a good chance that you know that what you're doing and the way you're reacting is off. It doesn't make sense. You still kind of feel that way and you can't control it, but you know that there's something wrong with the way you're feeling. You're not supposed to be feeling that way. People with personality disorders don't have that. They, in fact, think that they're right and everybody else is wrong. The problem is with everybody else. And I'm going to focus on the cluster B personalities because these are the personalities, first of all, that you're more likely to meet. And number two, they can sometimes be minimum frightening and sometimes dangerous, depending on the individual. Now, one more thing about personality disorders in general. We talked about personalities um, uh, earlier in the semester. And one of the things that I said was that personalities are flexible. The way you are in your home is slightly different than the way you are at work, at the park, in the party. You're still basically the same person, but your personality is flexible enough so that it can change to the situation. Where an individual with a personality disorder, their personality is not flexible. It is, in fact, maladaptive all the time, and it is inflexible. So, if I take someone who is histrionic, for example, someone who has to be the center of attention, well, you might enjoy being the center of attention sometimes if you're a normal person with a normal personality. Um, but if you go to somebody else's wedding, well, you know to be quiet and to give the bride and the groom the floor. Let them have their special day. But if you have a histrionic personality, you can't do that. It doesn't matter that it's somebody else's wedding. You have to find a way to make yourself be the center of attention. And that might include causing a scene or getting into a fight. And, it doesn't matter what's happening, the wedding, somebody's funeral, at your job, in your home, you're hanging out with some friends, you always have to be the center of attention. And if you're not, you have to create a problem or you have to create a scene or something to make you that center of attention. Now, it's not that simple. There are more aspects to histrionic personality than just that, but just an example of being inflexible. Um, Now, the first personality disorder that I want to talk about is antisocial personality disorder. And this is going to include some symptoms or some traits. First of all, you must have at least three of the first criterion. So that's going to include failure to obey norms and laws. This usually includes criminal behavior, um, lying and deception and manipulation of others for profit or for amusement. So you're just manipulating people to sort of make money off of them or to get something out of them, or just sometimes because you just find it enjoyable to manipulate people. There's going to be impulsive behavior, irritability and aggression, a blatant disregard for yourself and for others. So think about driving your car really fast, just jumping off of things, or getting, putting other people's lives at risk. Uh, a pattern of irresponsibility and a lack of remorse. So when bad things happen, most people with a normal kind of personality will feel awful that they hurt someone else or that they hurt themselves. But people with antisocial personality don't have that remorse. And so they don't feel bad afterwards. One of the things that is important to point out here, and you'll see there in criterion B, you have to be at least 18 years old to be considered antisocial. One of the reasons for this is that if you go to find a teenager, a lot of teenagers are going to fit this mold because teenagers haven't been socialized completely yet. They still kind of live in their teenage world. And so it's quite common for you to meet someone who's a teenager who does things where they get themselves in danger or put other people in danger. They do things that are they don't obey the norms. They do sometimes lie to and manipulate people for their own profit. And it's quite common for teenagers to act that way, but it's much less common for an adult who is healthy or who has a healthy personality to behave this way. Usually, someone who is younger than 18 might be dealing with a conduct disorder. And so oftentimes we do find that children with, or I should say, adults who are antisocial had a conduct disorder before they were around 15 years old. They might have hurt animals. They might have gotten into trouble a lot, maybe in and out of jails, things like that. And then criterion D is that specifically it is not schizophrenia and it is not bipolar disorder. Schizophrenics will sometimes not obey norms because they're deluded. Um, or people who are bipolar might commit crimes not because they enjoy it or for the pleasure of it, but because in the middle of a manic episode, they do things that they wouldn't normally do when they weren't manic. So, uh, people who are antisocial must have at least three of those symptoms. Now, one of the things that you might have heard is that people who are antisocial are psychopaths or vice versa, or they might be sociopaths. And uh, the difference here is just that psychopathy and sociopathy are not part of the DSM. You get diagnosed as being antisocial, and researchers often research psychopathy or sociopathy. So, uh, what are some of the difference? Well, psychopaths are antisocial. Not all antisocial people are necessarily psychopathic. So, um, people who are antisocial may not necessarily commit crimes. They may not necessarily hurt others. They might, but that's not necessarily um, something that they all do. If I come back up here, you need three of these symptoms, but you don't need all of them. And so you might be somebody who is impulsive, who is irritable and has aggression and has a blatant disregard for safety of yourself and others, but you don't have criminal behavior. And so antisocial doesn't always mean a psychopath. And in fact, some jobs tend to have more antisocial people in them. CEOs have higher levels of antisocial people. Cops have a higher level of antisocial people, and chefs sometimes have higher levels of antisocial people. Uh, that doesn't mean that these people are committing crimes. It just means that they fit the diagnosis. Um, if you're a psychopath or a sociopath, there is a greater chance that you are dealing with um, crimes that are committed. Now, I have a couple of pictures on the screen there, just so to give you just a general feeling more than anything else. People like the Joker or Dexter, these people would be psychopaths. They, um, uh, first of all, think they're right. They sort of make they have feelings that what they're doing is right and that everybody else is wrong, that everybody else isn't doing it right. These people lack a sense of uh, conscience, um, and they tend to be at least a little bit smarter. They oftentimes, these individuals will, um, excuse me, learn to control their feelings and their behaviors because they know that if they act the way they want to act, other people get put ill at ease, and then they can't manipulate them. So they learn to act normally. And so, for example, in the psychological literature, there was a young woman who said, when someone tells you, when my friend told me that her dog died, I acted sad like everybody else because you're supposed to act that way. Not because she cared about the dog. And in fact, she went on to kind of imply that she believed no one cared about the dog. Everybody was just, even the other friends that were acted sad were just pretending too. She didn't realize that other people actually felt bad for her friend whose dog had died. Um, Now, I said they're a little bit smarter, not than you and me necessarily, but they tend to be a little bit smarter than the individual we might call a sociopath. A sociopath is going to be more like, Tony Soprano there, a gangster. These individuals actually can have normal kinds of emotions where they love people and they have, I don't know, friends that they love and family members that they love. The psychopath has a harder time just having almost any kind of um, uh, connection and to others. But the sociopath doesn't. And the problem with the sociopath is that they don't control their emotions correctly. They're way more impulsive, and they're also going to react in ways that don't really make sense. And so they get very passionate about something, and then instead of I don't know, devoting their time to it, they might become aggressive, and they can't control that. Their fourth picture there of the gentleman in the mugshot, that is something that we would call acquired sociopathy. That gentleman, when he was young, was in a car accident and he destroyed parts of his brain, specifically parts of his frontal lobe. As an adult, he kidnapped a woman, um, stole her car with her in it, took her to a ATM, forced her to take money out, and then took her back to his apartment where he proceeded to rape her for several weeks. Eventually, something clicked in him. He took her, put her back in the car, drove her to her home, gave her back what was left of the money he stole, and said to her, "Hey, I had a great time. I hope you had a great time too. Here's my number. Call me later if you want to hang out." And of course, she called the cops and they caught him. This gentleman has problems with impulsivity and lack of control. And if you were to ask him, is it okay to kidnap someone and rape them? He would be able to say, no, of course that's not okay. That's awful. But in the moment, he had no control over that. And so he just allowed his impulses to lead to that kind of crime. So there are different versions of this kind of antisocial behavior. It's not all very simple. And in fact, there's a lot of overlap, not only with psychopathy and sociopathy and acquired sociopathy and antisocial personality disorder, but with other things like narcissistic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder. There's a lot of overlap, and it's not very clear, um, categories. Sometimes we talk about them as though they're clear categories because it's easier to sort of picture that clear version than it is to sort of understand that there are a lot of symptoms and there's a lot of overlap. Um, what you're seeing here is the difference between the psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder. Um, so you'll notice that some of these things, the overlap here, the presence since around 15 years of age, criminal behavior, lying, deception, manipulation, lack of remorse, blatant disregard for the safety of self and others, impulsive behavior. These things, there's a lot of overlap between them, but between antisocial and psychopathy. So just because you have one doesn't mean that you have the other. But if you are a psychopath in the DSM, what you will be diagnosed as is antisocial. Um, Here I kind of want you to see that again the overlap between psychopathy, sociopathy, and acquired sociopathy, and some of the ways that they're different. Um, Psychopathy, we tend to think of being as inborn or at least developmental. So either this person was born this way, or something in their life, especially in childhood, created these kinds of behaviors. What kind of things in childhood? Sexual abuse. There's a lot of weird sexual relationships between, especially boys who are psychopaths and their mothers. Things like mom bathed the son until he was, 17 or 19. Mom had, talked about sex a lot with the son, not in normal mom, dad, or parent child ways, but in ways that make the child feel dirty or bad. Sociopathy, we tend to think more as being learned and more related to trauma, uh, physical abuse in childhood, being around, let's say, gang members, or being where you saw a lot of death and trauma in childhood. Where acquired sociopathy is specifically trauma to the brain, damage to the brain. Uh, Usually, uh, when we think of psychopathy, we think of someone that has no anxiety, no remorse, no fear or guilt. These people lack emotions, where the person who is a sociopath doesn't lack emotion, they just can't regulate it. We call it dysregulation. And so they might feel excited, but instead that turns into aggression. They might feel sad, but that turns into vindictiveness or something like that. Um, and the person with acquired sociopathy, again, this is a brain issue where now the person doesn't know how to react normally, doesn't know how to stop impulses. Um, uh, the psychopath does not feel remorse. They don't have a lot of empathy. Um, they have normal cognitive emotions. They can explain to you why something is right or wrong, but they don't feel those emotions in their body, and they often feel that everybody else also doesn't feel them. Um, the sociopath, again, just has this dysregulation. They also can explain cognitive emotions normally. Um, and in fact, the sociopath sometimes has like a very specific honor code, and it doesn't necessarily always make sense to us. But they have, like, you don't hurt children or something like that. They have an honor code that they try to follow, but they don't necessarily always follow it because dysregulation occurs and they don't know how to control their emotions. And again, the acquired sociopathy, we talk more about the problems with the networks in the brain. Okay. Um, let me make this point here. Um, you can A way to think about psychopathy, which is, I talk about a lot about the overlap. Um, a way to think about the psychopath is that the psychopath is antisocial and narcissistic. They think of themselves as being more important than others. They don't care about others. They're very self-obsessed. Those types of things. With a sociopath, you can consider this person as being antisocial and borderline, lack of control. They think everybody's trying to abandon them, things like that. And so there's a lot of maybe self-hatred, self-damage, and self-hurting. Um, and then, of course, the acquired sociopathy. Again, we just go back to the frontal lobe damage. So this is just a way to think about psychopathy and sociopathy that might make it a little more simple. Some statistics on antisocial personality disorder. Um, in the prison population, 70 to 80% of people are considered antisocial. 15 to 25% are considered sociopaths. And in the female population, 7% of them are considered sociopaths. In the normal population, about 3% of people can be considered antisocial, and only about 1% would be considered a psychopath. And so we see that there is a direct relationship there between some antisocial behavior and, antisocial personality disorder and criminal behavior. Uh, Another important point is that there is a high percentage, a high rate of people with brain damage that go in and out of the prison system as well. So when we talked about acquired sociopathy, we know that there is a high rate of that as well. Now, borderline personality disorder, I always like to almost think of it as the opposite of that psychopath, where the psychopath does not show a lot of emotion, and they can be quite vindictive, but they can sort of bide their time and manipulate others, etc. The borderline person almost has too many emotions, and they're all very raw. Their emotions are unstable, their self-image is unstable, they tend to not think highly of themselves, and their relationships are volatile and unstable. This person has a lot of self-destructive behavior. They might cut, they might try to kill themselves a lot, they might take pills. They do a lot of things that are self-destructive. These people have an intense fear of abandonment. And in fact, they're always afraid that other people, their friends, their family members, their loved ones, are secretly trying to abandon them. And so the borderline individual will push the people away. Get away from me. I hate you. I don't want you in my life. Get out now. And of course, after someone deals with that long enough, they will leave. And then that's just, a reinforcement for the individual with borderline personality, uh, that they were always right, that the person was always meant to leave, and uh, they just happened to be right once again. Um, there is a high relationship between history of physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse, and having a borderline personality disorder. And of course, because women are much more likely to deal with, especially sexual abuse, than men, women are much more likely to be diagnosed as being borderline than men are. Um, in order to have borderline personality disorder, you have to have 5 of these traits, which includes the fear of abandonment, as I mentioned, difficult interpersonal relationships. So not just one relationship that is toxic or difficult, but most of your relationships are difficult. Uncertainty about self-image or identity. This person might feel like, they might change identities on a regular basis. They don't really know who they are. Um, Impulsive behavior, emotional changeability and hyperactivity. This person sort of changes emotions rapidly. Um, they might be hyperactive. They might be doing one thing and they sort of do another, and they always seem energetic and like they always have to be doing something else. A lot of feelings of emptiness, difficulty controlling intense anger. So with anger, it sort of becomes uncontrollable for them. And transient suspiciousness and disconnectedness. They kind of randomly feel like people are after them or people secretly want to hurt them, and they don't feel connected emotionally to others. All right, guys, I'm going to pause here. And in the next video, I'm going to talk about dissociative disorders.